The following is not a hypothetical scenario for a distant future. It is a description of geophysical processes occurring beneath British Columbia right now. In the last 72 hours, data streaming from the Canadian National Seismograph Network, managed by Natural Resources Canada, has fundamentally altered the risk assessment for the entire Salish Sea region. Meteorologists might use the word unsurvivable for storms, but the geophysicists, tectonicists, and seismologists tracking this event are using a phrase that carries even more finality in the geological record: a complete margin reset. While the public looks to the sky for danger, the true threat is organizing beneath their feet. A catastrophic convergence of three separate geological engines is occurring simultaneously along the Pacific coast of Canada. This is not a localized tremor. This is a verdict on decades of coastal development in one of Canada's most densely populated economic corridors. This is tectonic fury. Hi, my name is Daniel, and this is Natural Disasters. What is actually forming right now? Let me explain the mechanics of the system active along the west coast of Canada, because they are genuinely unlike anything Natural Resources Canada or Public Safety Canada has had to communicate to the Canadian public in our lifetime. The first component is a rapid, unprecedented change in the behavior of the Cascadia Subduction Zone. This 1,000-kilometer fault, where the Juan de Fuca Plate slides beneath the North American Plate, stretches from Vancouver Island down past the border. Typically, this plate is locked, accumulating stress. Every 12 to 15 months, we observe episodic tremor and slip, or ETS events, slow, safe releases of energy. The last ETS event concluded 4 months ago. Yet, GNSS monitoring stations near Ucluelet and Port Alberni have just detected a sudden retrograde slip. The plate isn't just locked. The overriding North American plate is bulging backward at an accelerated rate, indicating extreme stress accumulation. NRC and scientists are tracking ground deformation that should take decades occurring in mere days. The second component is equally alarming. Deep crustal seismic monitors are detecting a cluster of harmonic tremors at a depth of 35 kilometers beneath the Strait of Georgia. Harmonic tremors are distinct from normal earthquake signals. They represent the movement of fluids, often magma or superheated water, through fractured rock. While British Columbia is home to volcanoes like Mount Meager, this activity is occurring directly beneath the Salish Sea, suggesting that the massive stress from the subduction zone is forcing superheated crustal fluids upward along shallow, active crustal faults, lubricated and ready to pop. The third and final component is a massive submarine anomaly on the Fraser River Delta slope. This feature, already identified by geological surveys as inherently unstable due to the sheer volume of glacial sediment deposited over millennia, is failing. Marine geologists mapping the seabed have recorded a localized seabed displacement of 2 meters over a 5-kilometer stretch near the Roberts Bank Superport. It is an atmospheric river equivalent of sediment, supersaturated with pore water pressure triggered by the escalating deep harmonic tremors. The entire slope, which supports critical port infrastructure and submarine telecommunications cables linking Vancouver Island to the mainland, is on the verge of a catastrophic mass wasting event. These three elements, a rapidly stressing megathrust fault, shallow crustal faults primed by fluid migration, and a massive unstable underwater slope, are locked in a feedback loop. The numbers terrifying scientists are not wind speeds or rainfall totals. They are centimeters of ground displacement, hertz of harmonic tremor, and pore pressure readings on the seabed. This afternoon, the Geological Survey of Canada is likely to elevate the probability of a magnitude 9.0 plus Cascadia rupture in the next 7 days from less than 1% to over 50%. That is a statistical shift with no precedent in Canadian history. The chronology of this looming catastrophe began not with a bang, but with a silent mathematical anomaly that initially went unnoticed by the general public. At 8:12 Pacific Standard Time on February 14, 2026, a high-precision GNSS station located near Ucluelet on the rugged west coast of Vancouver Island recorded a sudden westward shift of 12 centimeters in less than 4 hours. To a casual observer, 12 centimeters sounds negligible. To the seismologist at the Geological Survey of Canada's Pacific Geoscience Centre in Sydney, it was a siren. Under normal conditions, the North American plate is being compressed eastward at a rate of about 4 centimeters per year. For it to snap 12 centimeters westward in a single morning suggests that the elastic limit of the crust has been reached. The spring is no longer coiling, it is starting to fracture. By March 2, 2026, the situation transitioned from a crustal anomaly to a deep-seated geophysical crisis. Ocean Networks Canada, operating the Neptune Underwater Observatory, began reporting an unprecedented surge in pore water pressure along the subduction front. Deep-sea pressure sensors 300 kilometers offshore from Tofino recorded pulses of warm, mineral-rich fluids venting from the seafloor. This is the geophysical equivalent of a steam valve failing on a nuclear reactor. As the Juan de Fuca plate grinds beneath British Columbia, it carries water-saturated sediments into the depths. Under the immense heat and pressure of the subduction zone, that water is squeezed out. Usually, this process takes eons. Right now, it is happening with explosive speed. The fluid is lubricating the megathrust interface, turning a locked fault into a sliding one. At 14:45 Pacific Standard Time on March 15, 2026, the first cluster of harmonic tremors was detected. These weren't the sharp, jagged spikes of a standard tectonic earthquake. They were low-frequency, rhythmic vibrations, centered 25 kilometers beneath the Strait of Georgia, directly between Nanaimo and Vancouver. Dr. Eris Thorne, a senior researcher with Natural Resources Canada, described the data in an internal memo as symptomatic of large-scale lithospheric delamination. Essentially, the weight of the mountain ranges and the pressure of the subduction zone are causing a weak layer in the lower crust to detach. This delamination is allowing superheated mantle fluids to migrate upward, intersecting with the Leech River fault system. The tension in the scientific community reached a breaking point when ground inflation began to accelerate in the Garibaldi volcanic belt. Monitoring stations on the flanks of Mount Meager, north of Whistler, recorded a vertical uplift of 15 millimeters in just 72 hours. This is not volcanic inflation in the traditional sense. There is no magma chamber feeling. Instead, the entire southwestern corner of British Columbia is being tilted like a seesaw as the subduction zone prepares to rupture. The locked zone is no longer holding back the Pacific. It is buckling the continental shelf. But the most immediate, terrifying data point comes from the Fraser River Delta. This is the heart of Canada's Pacific Gateway. The cities of Richmond and Delta, the Vancouver International Airport, and the Roberts Bank Superport sit on a massive wedge of Holocene silt and sand, some of it 300 meters thick. On March 28, 2026, geotechnical sensors embedded in the riverbed near the George Massey Tunnel recorded a phenomenon known as pre-seismic creep. The soil, saturated by the spring freshet and destabilized by the deep harmonic tremors, is beginning to lose its structural integrity before the main earthquake even hits. We are looking at a system that is primed for total failure, says a simulated transcript from an emergency NRCAN briefing held in Ottawa. The Fraser Delta is not just a geographic feature, it is a seismic amplifier. The thick sediments will take the energy of a megathrust rupture and multiply it by a factor of 5. We are tracking a 15-kilometer deep focus near the southern tip of Texada Island. If that initiates a rupture, the liquefaction enrichment won't just damage buildings. It will turn the entire city into a fluid mass. The vulnerability of Canada's infrastructure in this corridor cannot be overstated. The Port of Vancouver handles $200 billion in trade annually. The rail lines of Canadian National and Canadian Pacific Kansas City, which funnel through the narrow canyons of the Fraser and Thompson rivers, are anchored to slopes that the Geological Survey of Canada now classifies as critically unstable. One major tremor will trigger thousands of landslides, severing the Trans-Canada Highway and the National Rail Link simultaneously. The clock isn't just ticking for a town or a city, it is ticking for the operational continuity of the Canadian state. The geophysical analysis is clear. The energy currently stored in the Cascadia margin is equivalent to several thousand megatons of TNT, and the trigger is already halfway pulled. The historical precedents that geologists in Vancouver and Victoria dread most are not buried in obscure textbooks. They are written in the very soil of the Pacific coast and etched into the oral histories of the indigenous peoples who have lived here for millennia. To understand the scale of what is organizing beneath British Columbia right now, we have to look back to 9 p.m. on January 26, 1700. On that night, the Cascadia Subduction Zone underwent a full margin rupture. A 1,000-kilometer section of the Earth's crust snapped. The resulting magnitude 9.0 earthquake was so powerful, it caused the coastline of what is now Vancouver Island to drop by 2 meters almost instantly, while pushing the seaward edge of the continent 10 meters to the west. The Geological Survey of Canada has spent decades mapping the ghost forests along the Pacific Rim National Park Reserve, stands of red cedar that were killed instantly when the land subsided and seawater rushed in. These are not just dead trees, they are silent witnesses to a geophysical reset. The tsunami that followed in 1700 was not a single wave, but a series of mountainous surges that wiped out the village of Lohta in Pachena Bay. Indigenous accounts from the Huayat First Nation describe a night where the sea rose up and swallowed the houses, leaving no survivors. Scientists at Natural Resources Canada have used these accounts alongside sediment core data to calculate that the 1700 event produced wave run-ups of over 15 meters on the west coast of Vancouver Island. But here is the statistic that has the current monitoring teams at the Pacific Geoscience Center in a state of clinical panic. The average interval between these massive Type A ruptures in the Cascadia zone is approximately 500 years, but the window of occurrence is as narrow as 300 years. We are currently at 326 years. We are not just in the window. We are at the statistical peak of the probability curve. The 2026 data is showing a coupling of systems that even the 1700 event lacked. In 1946, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck near the Forbidden Plateau on Vancouver Island. It was the strongest onshore earthquake ever recorded in Canada. It caused the bottom of Deep Bay to sink by 25 meters and triggered landslides that transformed the local topography. While a 7.3 is massive, it is a flea bite compared to the M9.0 the GSC is currently modeling. If the 1946 quake was a warning about local crustal faults, the 1700 quake was the blueprint for total regional collapse. What makes the current 2026 scenario exponentially more dangerous than these historical parallels is the system coupling with Canada's modern infrastructure. In 1700, there were no submarine fiber optic cables, no high voltage transmission lines crossing the Fraser River, and no millions of tons of industrial chemicals stored in the port of Vancouver. Scientists are looking at the 1929 Grand Banks earthquake off Newfoundland as a chilling comparative model for secondary effects. That M7.2 event triggered a massive submarine landslide that severed 12 transatlantic telegraph cables and sent a tsunami into the Burin Peninsula, killing 28 people. Now, project that onto the Fraser River Delta, where the sediment volume is 1,000 times greater and the trigger is a magnitude 9.0 megatrust rupture. The current forecast models generated by the GSC's OpenQuake platform are projecting a liquefaction verdict. This is a specific geophysical state where the water-saturated silts of the Fraser Delta, the ground beneath Richmond Delta and parts of Surrey, completely lose their shear strength under the stress of long-duration shaking. During the 1964 Alaska earthquake, which lasted nearly 5 minutes, entire neighborhoods slid into the sea because of this process. The 2026 models suggest that for a Canadian M9.0 event, the shaking duration will exceed 4 minutes. In that timeframe, the critical layers of the Fraser Delta, identified in NRCan's 2023 seismic hazard maps, will turn to liquid. We are no longer discussing a standard seismic event, notes a simulated report from a federal geotechnical review. We are discussing the physical transition of a populated landmass into a fluid state. The historical data from 1700 tells us the scale of the wave, but the data from 2026 tells us about the failure of the shelf itself. We have built Canada's Western Gateway on a foundation that the current geophysical data says is no longer solid. This cyclicity is the most terrifying part of the science. The Earth operates on a clock that does not care about human timelines or economic cycles. The 1700 event was the big one of its era. The 2026 event, based on the harmonic tremors and the accelerated GNSS displacement, is shaping up to be its successor, but with a twist. The triple engine of the subduction snap, the fluid migration in the Leech River fault, and the slope failure at Roberts Bank means the impact won't be sequential. It will be simultaneous. The history we are about to revisit is not just a tragedy. It is a total geophysical transformation of the Canadian landscape. The human stakes of this geophysical verdict are written in the lives of people like Maya Chen, a senior seismologist at the Pacific Geoscience Center in Sydney. For 20 years, Maya has lived with the knowledge that the ground beneath her office is a ticking clock, but the data streaming into her terminal on April 10, 2026 is different. It is no longer about probability, it is about the physics of an impending rupture. Her screen shows a heat map of crustal strain that has turned a bruised, violent purple across the entire Cascadia margin. In a simulated transcript of her final call to Public Safety Canada headquarters in Ottawa, her voice is steady, but the words are chilling. The locked zone is failing. We are seeing a cascade of microfractures from the Brooks Peninsula down to the Juan de Fuca Strait. This isn't a warning anymore. It's an obituary for the coast as we know it. Maya knows that when the snap occurs, she will have less than 90 seconds to secure her equipment before the first S-waves reach the lab. For the 800,000 residents of Vancouver Island, the geography of British Columbia is about to become a prison. Sarah Atleo, an emergency coordinator in Tofino, stands on the rugged coastline looking west. She has spent her career drilling for this moment, but the scale of the 2026 convergence renders traditional evacuation plans nearly obsolete. The high ground maps, carefully printed and distributed to every household, assume a standard tsunami. They do not account for a magnitude 9.0 event where the land itself subsides by 2 meters before the first wave even arrives. In Sarah's world, the golden hour of rescue is a myth. The road out, Highway 4, is a narrow ribbon of asphalt winding through the Mackenzie Range, prone to massive rock slides that the GSC warns will be triggered instantly. Tofino won't just be hit, it will be isolated, an island on an island, with no land-based rescue possible for weeks. The logistics of the mainland are equally grim. In the heart of the Fraser Delta, the city of Richmond sits behind a network of dikes and pumping stations designed to hold back the spring freshet of the Fraser River. But Richmond is built on the very liquefaction-prone silts that the NRCAN models now show as critically compromised. Consider the story of David Murray, a logistics manager at the Roberts Bank Superport. He oversees the movement of thousands of shipping containers daily, representing the lifeblood of the Canadian economy. Under his feet, the pore water pressure sensors are already registering the saturation that precedes a landslide. If the underwater slope fails, as the current data suggests, the terminal, a multi-billion Canadian dollar piece of infrastructure, will simply slide into the Georgia Strait, taking the national supply chain with it. The economic damage to Canada is estimated by Public Safety Canada to exceed 300 billion Canadian dollars within the first 48 hours. The power grid is the invisible skeleton of this crisis. Marc-André Tremblay is a lead technician at BC Hydro's Nicola substation near Merritt, the critical node where the massive power from the Columbia River dams is funneled toward the lower mainland. The 500 kilovolt transmission lines are anchored to the steep, unstable slopes of the Fraser Canyon. In a magnitude 9.0 event, these towers, some dating back to the mid-20th century, are projected to fail as the slopes they stand on undergo mass wasting. Marc-André knows that if those lines go down, the lights go out for 2.5 million people instantly. In the darkness, the automated systems for the George Massey Tunnel and the SkyTrain will lose secondary power within minutes as backup generators are swamped by liquefaction and flooding. The most terrifying personal story is perhaps that of the commuters on the Lions Gate Bridge or the Iron Workers Memorial. These icons of Vancouver skyline are engineering marvels, but they were not built for a 5-minute long M9.0 resonance event. Structural engineers at the University of British Columbia have run simulations showing that the sway generated by the deep crustal harmonic tremors will exceed the design tolerances of the suspension cables. For those stuck in traffic at 5 p.m. on the day of the rupture, there is no shelter. There is only the sensation of the earth becoming fluid and the structures built to defy it beginning to tear. The ecological stakes are equally catastrophic. The Fraser River is the world's most productive salmon river. A massive landslide in the Fraser Canyon, similar to the 1913 Hell's Gate slide, but on a scale 10 times larger, would permanently block the passage of salmon to their spawning grounds in the interior. This isn't just an environmental loss, it's a cultural and economic decapitation for indigenous communities and the commercial fishing industry alike. The sediment plume from the Roberts Bank failure would smother the sensitive eelgrass beds of the delta, destroying the nursery of the Salish Sea. This is the reality of the 2026 verdict. It is not just a disaster of falling buildings, it is the total collapse of the systems that make modern life in Canada possible. The power grid, the telecommunications cables, the highways, and the ports are all interconnected in a web of vulnerability that the geophysical data is now picking apart, thread by thread. The scientists at NRCAN aren't just watching a fault line, they are watching the unraveling of a civilization's infrastructure. The aftermath of a magnitude 9.0 Cascadia rupture is not a temporary state of emergency. It is the beginning of a new geological era for Western Canada. In the months and years following the 2026 event, the data streaming from Natural Resources Canada will likely document a process known as post-seismic relaxation. But for the millions living in the impact zone, it will feel like a never-ending siege. The primary rupture is merely the first domino. Geophysicists at the Geological Survey of Canada are already modeling the Coulomb stress transfer, a phenomenon where the energy released in one section of a fault increases the pressure on adjacent segments. For British Columbia, this means the stress shifted from the Cascadia margin could trigger a secondary catastrophic rupture on the Queen Charlotte Fault near Haida Gwaii, or accelerate the internal deformation of the northern Vancouver Island crustal blocks. The geography of the province will be permanently altered. The ecoseismic subsidence, the literal dropping of the coastline, will turn thousands of hectares of prime agricultural land in the Fraser Valley into permanent salt marshes. Richmond and Delta, once the crown jewels of the lower mainland's residential expansion, will face a permanent inundation scenario. The dikes that held back the Fraser River for a century will be useless against a landscape that has moved 2 meters closer to sea level. Engineers from Public Safety Canada and the provincial government will be forced to make the unbearable choice: which communities to attempt to reclaim with multi-billion Canadian dollar seawall projects, and which to abandon to the Salish Sea. The economic heart of the country will be in a state of prolonged cardiac arrest. With the Roberts Bank superport destroyed by the submarine landslide, and the port of Vancouver's deep-water berths compromised by liquefied soils, Canada's primary gateway to the Pacific will be severed. The port of Prince Rupert, far to the north, will become the nation's only lifeline, but its rail connections through the rugged interior are equally vulnerable to the increased landslide activity triggered by the post-seismic aftershock sequence. Economists estimate the long-term reconstruction costs will exceed 500 billion Canadian dollars, a figure that represents the single largest economic shock in Canadian history. The just-in-time supply chain that feeds the grocery stores in Calgary, Edmonton, and Winnipeg will be revealed as a fragile illusion, as the Trans-Canada Highway remains severed at multiple points through the Fraser Canyon for months, if not years. But the most subtle and terrifying risk lies in the deep-seated plumbing of the Garibaldi volcanic belt. The massive shift in crustal pressure from a magnitude 9.0 earthquake has historically been linked to increased volcanic activity. Mount Meager, already identified by NRCAN as the most likely candidate for a large-scale explosive eruption in Canada, sits atop a fractured hydrothermal system. The 2026 seismic event could act as a mechanical shaker, destabilizing the precarious volcanic edifices and allowing the pressurized magma reservoirs to migrate toward the surface. We could be looking at a multi-decade period of heightened volcanic and seismic unrest, a tectonic winter for the Pacific Northwest. We must be clear about what we are seeing in the data right now. The infrastructure we rely on, the fiber optic cables that carry our data, the pipelines that move our energy, the bridges that connect our cities, was designed during a period of anomalous seismic quiet. We have mistaken a brief pause in the Earth's movement for a permanent state of stability. The geophysical engines of Canada do not operate on a human scale. They do not care about real estate values, provincial budgets, or the timing of an election. They obey the cold, indifferent laws of plate tectonics. The most dangerous storm system in a generation was an atmospheric event, but the most dangerous geophysical event in a millennium is a geological verdict. The numbers don't lie. The GNSS displacement, the harmonic tremors, the pore water pressure spikes, they are the signatures of a system that has reached its limit. We are living on the edge of a margin that is resetting itself in real time. In 1 week, 1 month, or 1 year, we will have the names of the towns that became history. But right now, we have the data. And the data is telling us that the clock has run out. The Earth is not breaking, it is merely rearranging itself. It is our presence in its path that creates the disaster. As the pressure continues to drop in the Central Rockies, and the strain continues to build beneath the Georgia Strait, the only rational response is to acknowledge the inevitability of the physics. Stay informed. Know your local emergency protocols. Understand the geology of the ground you stand on. This is Nature of Disasters. I'm Daniel. Follow the data. I'll see you on the other side of this one.